Senator Harris.
Thank you. Secretary Nielsen, at a roundtable 42 days ago at the Homeland Security Committee meeting, I asked Deputy Secretary Duke and Undersecretary Krebs whether DHS is prioritizing risk and vulnerability assessments for the states. I didn't get a clear commitment that you are. And I'd also like to know, have you received the request that we made for a timetable for those assessments, because we've not received a response to that request?
Yes, ma'am. We are prioritizing. We have 19 that are state and localities that are either been completed or in process. We continue to offer the systems, but we have made the commitment and prioritized resources that any state or locality that requests that, we will have it completed before the midterm election.
Do you have a date for completion?
Of the 19, I can get back to you, but those are the only ones who have requested so far.
Can you commit to completing all these assessments by June 1st, which would be 5 months before the election?
Depending on who requests, but I'm happy to work with you on timelines as soon as we get a request.
And of the number you mentioned, you said have been completed or in the process?
Yes, that's correct.
How many have been completed?
To my knowledge, 15. If that's not correct, I'll ask Jeanette Manfred to correct me when she speaks.
Okay, because you earlier said in the process of or have been completed.
That's right. So I believe 15 have been completed, but again, she'll verify if I have that number wrong.
Okay, well, we heard from her yesterday, and she said that 14 are in the process.
Okay.
So
that's 19
Can you
total.
follow up with how many have actually been completed?
Sure. And it's also a little confusing because, of course, there's states and localities. So 19 is states and localities.
Okay, my question concerns states. Thank
Perfect.
you. And is there a protocol for following up to ensure that the reforms that you recommend have actually been completed?
We do continue to work with them through hygiene, scanning, and others.
Is there a protocol to do that?
So that is the protocol that we offer. But again, it's all voluntary, so it's not a mandatory check.
Okay. In the intelligence community, there's a concept called duty to warn. And Secretary Johnson, I'd like to ask you, and essentially the concept is that if a federal agency learns that a person is at a risk of imminent harm or an entity is at risk, that they should be informed, and obviously without giving up critical information that we have in terms of sources and methods. Do you believe in the future that the department should have a duty to warn states if the Department of Homeland Security is informed that there are imminent cybersecurity threats to their election systems?
Yes, absolutely.
Secretary Nielsen, do you agree with that?
Yes.
And will you commit then to this committee that you will, in fact, warn those states when you become aware of imminent threat to their cybersecurity systems for elections?
With the interagency, yes, ma'am.
Okay. And when you learn of these threats, will you also commit to informing immediately congressional committees, and particularly the Intelligence Committee?
As you know, we will work with you on that. As you know, the entire process is voluntary. What we find is when we notify others of who the victims are, unfortunately, it has a chilling effect, and we no longer get the information from those who have been attacked. So we'll continue to work with you on how to do that.
So my question is, will you commit to specifically informing the Senate Intelligence Committee when you become aware of those threats?
We'll continue to work with you on the best protocols for that, yes.
So the answer is yes.
The answer is it's very difficult if a state does not want to be identified because it's a voluntary relationship. I don't want to do anything that would limit our ability to understand who is being attacked. So we'd have to work with the victim, just like we do in any other sector, and work with you to make sure that we do it in the right way.
Would you commit to informing your Oversight Committee, which is the Homeland Security Committee of the United States Senate?
I understand your question, and again, we'll have to work with the victims. It's a voluntary system.
You sit on the Principals Committee of the National Security Council, is that correct?
I'm a member, yes.
Okay, and that committee is comprised of cabinet officials and is responsible for advising the President and coordinating policy on America's most serious national security challenges. Has the Principals Committee held a meeting focused on the security of the 2018 election?
I myself hosted it, yes.
And when did that meeting take place?
A few weeks ago.
And what decisions were made regarding election security?
That state and locals remain in charge, that DHS needs to continue to expand our toolkit of what we can provide and support, that we need to work on tear lines, we need to work on victim notification, we need to work on clearances, and we need to work on communications to make sure that the public is aware of the threat.
And did you indicate timelines and due dates for what should happen before the 2018 election?
Well, clearly everything should be done before that. But yes, for each one of those, we have an agreement on a path forward with the timeline.
Will you provide that to this committee?
Happy to.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Harris. The chair would recognize himself and then the vice chairman and then members based upon seniority. Secretary Johnson, I remember very clearly when you called a Gang of 8 meeting for the notification, and if I remember my timing right, I think Senator Reid actually might have had a brief the end of July because he happened to be in town, and when everybody got back the 1st of September, you sat down with us and sort of presented us the scenario, and at that time talked about the critical infrastructure designation. It was followed some weeks after that by an all-members brief in the Senate. I'm sure it was in the House as well. And I think you alluded to the fact that that was not received by the states or election officials, the critical infrastructure designation. In hindsight, for us knowing going forward, was that a mistake to even mention that? Did that taint the pool of their trust with us, with government, and maybe what the intent was on their part?
Well, we put it aside, and I was very pleased with the level of participation that we got. I thought it was important. I thought that the critical infrastructure designation, frankly, is something we should have done years before. It made so much sense. I think that the disadvantage we had with the timing was that it was in the midst of an election year, and a rather heated election year. So I did put it aside, but then I, just before leaving office, came back to it because I thought it was something important to do. But in answer to your question, Senator, I think that we were able to build, in the time permitted, a pretty constructive relationship with a lot of states, red states and blue states, that all came to DHS to seek our assistance in the election season.
I appreciate that, and even Secretary Nielsen's reluctance to be able to say I would definitely do it this way. Let me just say, in our hearings, we found that states do not want a critical infrastructure designation, that there's a red line there. And I think we've learned as this has gone on. We've seen it. It's visceral. It's something that can be overcome with trust. And I think that's why as we produce benefits to the customer, which is any official or locality that has an election, then we gain a little bit more trust, we gain a little bit more ability to play a bigger role in the partnership, but not in taking over. And I want to make it clear, our recommendations do not intend or suggest that the government take over elections. It's not the Secretary or the Department's view of that, and it wasn't from the last administration. But that designation did affect their willingness to come in and ask for help and suggest where problems were that they saw. Let me ask both of you. I'll start with you, Secretary Johnson. In 2016, were there any votes that were affected by this intrusion into any system in America?
Not to my knowledge, sir.
Secretary Nielsen?
We have no evidence that any votes were changed.
Secretary Nielsen, looking forward ahead to 2018, what is DHS's current estimation of the threat to our elections from Russia or any other hostile actor?
Thank you for the question. I think, as you've noted, many of you in the press conference yesterday, unfortunately, once these vulnerabilities have been made clear, it's not just Russia that we have to worry about, right? These are vulnerabilities and attack vectors that any adversary could pursue. So we think the threat remains high. We think vigilance is important, and we think there's a lot that we all need to do at all levels of government before we have the midterm elections. I will say our decentralized nature both makes it difficult to have a nationwide effect, but also makes it perhaps of greater threat at a local level. And of course, if it's a swing state or swing area, that can in turn have a national effect. So what we're looking at is everything from registration and validation of voters, so those are the databases, through to the casting and the tabulation of votes, through to the transmission, the election night reporting, and then of course the certification and the auditing on the back end. All of those are potential vulnerabilities. All of those are require different tools and different attention by state and locals. The last thing I would just quickly mention is we all continue to work with state and locals to also help them look at physical security. They need to make sure that the locations where the voting machines are kept, as well as the tabulation areas. They need access control and very traditional security like we would in other critical infrastructure areas.
I thank both of you, and let me just say for the public's education, there's a clear distinction between what we're here to talk about today, which is the election process and how an outside actor could impact or influence that, and versus, say, Russia's distinct campaign at societal chaos and their use of social media platforms. That's another area of investigation by this committee, but this particular area is focused on the elections and the process of one vote and it counts and that there's accuracy in that count. Vice Chairman.